So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and we are going to do a deep dive on travel in RPGs. Now, the first thing we want to say is we're certainly not disparaging travel as a general thing. Just the way that we play, it's very narrative. So we tend to handle those sorts of things differently than some players who like to play a little more crunchy. So what we're going to attempt to do in this video is a couple things. One, just have a discussion about going a little further as to why we don't put this in our games very often. But then also, not just be naysayers and say, well, if you are going to do it, go a little more in depth with what James mentioned and show you some actual practical ways to abstract it so that you can do this kind of thing in your game. And so, Jeff, tell me why it is you don't generally favor travel in your games.
So for me, it's just a matter of like you said, Tim, like the way that we tend to play in a lot of the groups that we're all in is very narrative. We tend to like think of the game very like cinematically. You know, I try to think of like a lot of like even like script writing things and stuff like that. And there's an idea in film called a plot cul-de-sac that I think kind of sums it up for me, which is basically when the movie will sort of get sidetracked on a tangent that never ends up coming back to matter at the end of the story. It's just like they go off, they do something else, and then they finally make it back onto the road they're supposed to be on and continue on the main story, just to end up realizing that the 20 minutes that they spent going on this little side thing doesn't actually matter to the grand scheme of things. And for me, a lot of travel things in RPGs tend to come across like that for me, where it's like, okay, so we know that we have this big, storyline that we're following that involves us going to this next city to do this big event. And then we spend 2 hours, rolling on random charts and fighting random, creatures in the forest that don't end up like really coming back to mean anything. And it's just like, yeah, we were still playing the game and it was probably fine. But that time that you've spent, doing that could be time that you've spent furthering what everybody's attention is drawn to in the game. And for me, it's so easy for travel just to not end up mattering. Of just like, okay, so we did all these things, we spent some rations, we fought some random encounters, we saw some random NPCs. But if none of that happened, the story would be identical, And like that for me is where a lot of travel falls short, which is why in the quick tips video I mentioned, making it matter, making these scenes come back later and tie into the story, because then that sort of removes the big barrier for me, which is like, we could be doing anything in this RPG session and like, this is where we're spending our time, and if that's enjoyable to your table, you like the random roll tables, you like the hex crawl, again, like I said in the last video, by all means do that. But for me, it ends up feeling like a waste of time. And like, why didn't we just get to the part that's exciting to everybody instead of having to sort of deal with the drudgery of just sort of day-to-day walking and, fighting random battles that aren't going to matter and things like that. So yeah, that for me is where travel ends up falling short a lot. Is that it just doesn't matter. If you got rid of it, nothing would change except that you would have more time.
I would also like to jump in a little bit and maybe change your perspective on travel versus other things that we don't apply all these systems to. So very much saying the same thing as Jeff, but I want to show you why what we're suggesting isn't disparaging or dunking on this idea, but instead showing you why most attempts at this idea are flawed from the beginning. And I think that's because a lot of times people hear about travel and they think, yeah, I want that, and then insert verb here. A lot of times, or adjective, sorry. A lot of times that adjective is realism. I want that realism. Sometimes it's tone. I want that feeling. The thing is, for some reason, we apply all of these, we put all of our own baggage on travel, but every time there's a scene that somebody's eating, we're having a conversation with an NPC, right? There's no eating systems, not that I've seen in a narrative game. Obviously, I'm sure someone's come up with one. but we're not like, all right, guys, so we're going to sit down at the table. We're going to have a random roll table of if the server is nice to us or not. That's what most travel systems feel like to me. But it's funny because you're right, Jeff. They don't further the story. They don't do anything. They don't help you. Why the heck are there so many of them? So I just wanted to throw that perspective out there, that it's something that for some reason we've built all this stuff on that we don't really need to. And I think instead we should focus on making travel do something. And I think the system that we put in a Dead Man's Guide is one way of very many to do that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good distinction. And so I think on the heels of that, I do want to have a conversation about sort of what are the things that we think we like about it and kind of deconstruct it there. And so I do want to have that conversation, but I just want to point out specifically to what you just said, James. So we are actually, James and I are part of, we're co-founders of an independent publisher called Absolute Tabletop, and Jeff has worked with us in a freelance capacity, and we released a book called A Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin, and it's our own campaign setting for 5e. And in that book, we wrote a travel subsystem that is very narrative and kind of goes through what James talked about. So I just wanted to point out what you were talking about there, but we will get to us explaining to you some tips you can basically use to make your own travel subsystem if you want to narratively. But before we do that, I just kind of wanted to think, I'm like, all right, is it that we want, like, what is the goal? When we say we want travel and random encounters and those kinds of things, is it that we want the world to feel wild and dangerous and unpredictable? Is that what it is? And is it us as game masters feeling like, if we just threw monsters at the players every time, that would be unfair? Is that why? Or is it because, so we want to kind of put the onus on a roll table? Does it happen or does it not happen? And we've also talked about when rolls are fun and dice. So I don't know. What are you thinking here? What are we trying to get out of it that we're not achieving? And is there any good in it?
If I could narrow that down just a little bit, and we can use this example or another example, but I think that it opens a bigger question of, well, all different types of travel are different. Are you simulating that it's difficult to move around in the city because it's so populated, or are you simulating that it's hard to get across this desert, right? So what I would do, Tim, is ask you, when you said earlier, you were trying to wedge this travel system in there for our game. And again, maybe this isn't a good example. What were you trying to achieve, right? I think it's more on a personal basis for like a case-by-case thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was basically just trying to make it feel like getting from one place to another was dangerous, so that you couldn't openly, like, just take a stroll from one city to another city. It was like, no, there's threats here. And so that was kind of really what it's funny because I hadn't even thought about it, but yeah, that's going back. I wanted it to feel like, oh man, we have to go there, or should we stay here?
And I think that's what's funny about your question is so many people don't ask what they're trying to do. And I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, it's fair.
Yeah, there's, I think, a lot of, especially in D&D 5e specifically, there's so much baggage about what the game is supposed to be like from just like the years and years that have washed over the different iterations of it, that I feel like some people just include it because like that's how D&D is supposed to work. It's like, oh, well, when my dad told me about how he played it, 20 years ago, he told me about random roll tables and hex crawl, travel. So I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. So let me see if I can find some random roll tables. And it's like, I think part of it is just like the sort of baggage of the system is hanging on, and a lot of people don't necessarily know that it's totally okay to cut that loose if it's not supporting what you want out of the game. And again, if it is, then that's totally fine. But yeah, that it's so easy just to say like, oh, well, this is what people do in travel, so that's what I'm going to do, without asking that, I think, very important question, like, why am I including this in my game? What am I trying to get out of this? And I think that's an important question to answer when it comes to not just travel, but anything, in the game. of there's always an opportunity cost to any element you decide to have in the game. Combat, exploration, travel, social stuff, anytime you spend doing any one thing, you could be doing other things with that time instead. You only have so much time in a session to do that. So for me, it's just kind of a matter of, if I'm going to put time into this, why am I doing this instead of any of the other things that I can do? And for me, just like the random roll table stuff just has always felt like just the flimsiest option of like, I could do that, but instead I can make a scene that I can craft of my own, creativity, that I specifically craft to connect to something that the players are doing, or that a backstory that one of the players has, or an event that's going to come up that I can foreshadow with this, however I can use it. Like I trust myself to do it better than I trust the roll table to do it. And so much travel systems are just like, roll the dice and see what happens. And it's like, nothing against roll tables, in general, but they almost never do what they do as well as I feel like I could just do it if I just made it, which at that point I'm not using a subsystem anymore. I'm just making scenes,
Yeah, so I think something else too that struck me while you were talking, Jeff, was that if you look at, okay, so we have, I don't know exactly what to call it. The play style that I know has developed in the Absolute Tabletop official Facebook group, I want to call it like neo-narrative. I don't know what to call it. But it's a brand. It's a genre. It's a kind of like style. I feel like we are so in tune with making it have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and character arcs. And like you say, not just cinematic in terms of feeling big and epic, but following the storytelling beats of a television show or a film. I think that we try really hard to do that. And it's just, I'm realizing that to some people, there is 0% of that in their game. And this is totally fine, but I do realize there are some people who will roll up a character and at a surface level know the name and the stats and then want to throw that character at stuff. And it's not necessarily about what happens. It's just, so then what happens next? And then it's like, oh, and then we kill all those goblins. All right, cool, then what? And it's way less, it's a roguelike. It's more like what they're playing. And we're like on story mode. And that is probably one of the biggest differences and that's just for me to clarify specifically that I do understand that there's a play style that exists where they're like, no, the easiest way to make it go is to make it so that every time they have to go somewhere, I get to do a little roguelike. And then they throw all their resources at the challenge, and then they go on to the next one. And it's a style. And so, yeah, I think that's why. One of them is counterintuitive, like you say, to it's a plot cul-de-sac, and we identify that, whether we do it consciously or subconsciously, we identify that this isn't helping the tone and the feel and the flow of the game. This is taking away. We're pausing the flow and the narrative to waste time, and kind of as you put it. And I think we identify that, so we're like, yeah, no, take that out of there. Because if we were editing the film, we'd cut it. So I think as game masters, we're like, yeah. We're editing it in the prep phase of like, no, I'm cutting this because it would be on the cutting room floor. So, yeah.
I just want to add an extra wrinkle to what you're saying, because I don't think any of what you're saying is wrong. But it's more than just that is a style. And this is going to get a little, I don't want to say off into the weeds, a little further from this idea, but I promise I'll bring it back. So the Earth started, no. I really wanted to think of something really long ago. But the idea is the first time I ever saw a random roll table was in a magazine about role-playing games. It didn't say, or a random roll table, a random encounter roll table for traveling. It didn't say, use this when you want to X, Y, and Z. It said, use this the next time your players are traveling. And it had it, and he rolled, and some of these monsters I hadn't even heard of. This was like one of the the old Dungeon or Dragon magazines, whichever one Tim had at the time that I read as like a kid. Here's what that means. I was given the wrong tool and nobody ever told me. So this is going to be a somewhat bold claim, but I think that a lot of the people that is their style would appreciate at the very least, whether they'd like it more or not, a more narrative style of the game, because culturally stories, we can put the biggest pin in why we like Netflix right now. The reason I bring that up is because things like what we're going to talk about and the idea that you have to ask what your goal is before you start doing something are things that we've skipped because we've given somebody a roll table and it's reasonable for them to assume they're supposed to use it. But at no point did they go, hey, wait, are you sure I should use this? Because I want to do X, Y, and Z. No, somebody said, hey, want to do X, Y, and Z? And they go, yeah. And they go, well, here's a roll table to do it. In some cases, especially in the cases of this legacy baggage from D&D that Jeff mentioned, and again, huge separate topic that I'd love to talk about one day.
Sure.
A lot of the tools that people are given to make their games go, make games go in a very specific way. And not that we are, but we need to remember that some people are playing the way they were taught to be played. And I like to think that if they knew that another way, that some people would be converted because they would find something different in it, if not something that they found that they enjoyed better.
Yeah, I'm a convert, so I'll say yes. That was me. That exact same thing happened with the Provokers and Barker's Sir Celine game. So yeah, that was me. So I'll just say, yep, hard agree.
Yeah, no, and I think it's an important distinction to make too. Of like, what we're saying here is not like if you use roll tables, you should stop it. You should do what we say instead. It's like if you have or you use them but you don't like them, or you used to use them and you don't anymore and you wish you had something else, like that we're looking for other tools for other people. We're not trying to tear down the concept of random encounters and random roll tables. If you like that tool and you use it and you know why, then you can keep using it. But there should be other ways for people who don't want to do it that way. And there's not a whole lot when it comes to travel out there that fills the role of, there's still some stuff you can use that's not quite so random and disconnected, So it's more about both things can exist. We can have random roll tables and random encounters for the games who want that. And we can have narrative travel and, character arcs and character moments for the games that want that. And like both can exist, but one is very common and almost like fully, integrated into all of D&D, and one is rarely seen, So I think that's kind of where we're trying to shore up.
Yeah, for sure. And just to make one quick distinction, specifically random encounter roll tables, because what we're about to show you is actually got a bunch of roll tables, but not specific to 5 or like 1d6 owl bears show up, or like that. They're so yeah, I think this is probably a really good segue to say, all right, so what's our solution to this? Well, we have one tool that we use. So this is a disclaimer that everything we're going to talk about here is in a book that we wrote. It's called A Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin on absolutetabletop.com. But this isn't a commercial for the book as much as we're basically going to tell you exactly what we built in there so that you can do it yourself. Now, if you want to go get the book, of course you can. The PDF is available now, but this isn't going to be like a paywall where it's like, and if you want to find out how the good travel, go. No, we're going to show you exactly what we did. We're going to teach you quickly how to make your own roll table and make it go yourself. So, in the book, this system is called Treacherous Travel. And this is something that Jeff and I actually worked on. Jeff was very instrumental in like making this come to life. And basically, this is a narrative subsystem that is doing all the stuff that we have been encouraging you to do. So like focusing on the important parts. That's really what this is. So the system is based on 2 different things. Glances, which are just like momentary descriptions of something unique to the travel. And then scenes, which are like larger events that you play out. By thinking of that, we're going to help you build some roll tables and decide how you want to make your travel go. James, tell me a little bit about this kind of subsystem, how it works, and why it works.
So one of the things, especially based on everything we just said in this video and the prior video, that I need to say is this is a subsystem that was written for a book, for a place called Dragon Grin that has a very specific tone and feel to it. And so what this means is this subsystem will actually work for a lot of cases, and I have to give that. But obviously, if we were to give examples, say, the fact that the examples don't work for your world, it's important to remember what you're doing and that this subsystem can be separated from the book. You'll see what I mean in a minute, but the idea is we have glances and we have scenes. Now, is something that happens that you sort of see on the way. And it's got a little more than this, but the way I like to imagine the glances are the scenes in the montage from Lord of the Rings. There are beautiful, sweeping scenes, like things that you would have never realized. And you've got your little fellowship walking, and those things happened. And if you think about how short those scenes are in the film, like as a viewer, you go, oh man, and they were in that ice-covered landscape for a very long time, and they moved. It gives you this idea of motion. It's going to sound funny, but the same thing works in RPGs. The reason this works is because you get to montage your players. Now, this works one extra because as part of the subsystem, it tells you what happens, something that you can jump onto narratively and describe while the players are traveling. And then there is a mechanical effect to a lot of them. In some cases, I believe they can be narrative. Like, for example, one of the glances is something simple, inclement weather. That could be so different depending on where you are. So it works in a lot of places, but just saying it rains on your way there is not enough. So we've rolled on this roll table to get inclement weather. Not only am I going to give this great description of how your socks are now wet, it's raining so hard that you hear the water hitting the cobblestones and it's filling your ears and you can barely hear anything over it. And also you have to take a constitution save or gain a level of exhaustion. This has not derailed the story. It's made your players feel like something is happening because something is happening to their character, their only interface with the world, truly, mechanically. And they'll never forget if you had a good description about how it was raining the day they showed up at the gates of Drift Chapel. We've done all of these things, and that's just the first part of the generator.
And so somewhere on the screen here, you're actually going to see a chunk of one of the D20 roll tables. There's going to be several entries here, and these are specific ones that you can use in your game, but you can also then continue filling out the list with any ideas that you have.
So if the glances are these montage moments, those quick 5 seconds of screen time where we see things happening, sort of get that travel feel. A scene is a little bit more zoomed in. It's the moment where they stop on the side of the road and they see a traveler in danger, and they have to decide, do we help them? Do we not? It's something that gives them a moment where they can actually act in character and make decisions and go. Where glances, it's kind of just going to happen narratively. You can just kind of tell them what happens. Maybe they make a roll or two, but you don't spend too much time on it. A scene is a little bit more, and it gives them something to actually sink their teeth into that's happening right now and can act as an encounter that they get to participate in. So basically how the scene works is that we have a table that has 3 columns on it. There's the tone of the scene. So is it dark? Is it hopeful? Is it chaotic? Is it whimsical? We have the actual event that's happening. So an NPC encounter, a combat, a grim omen, and then we have something that it's related to. So a PC's background, a notable location in the world, an important NPC bond that a party member has, a recent party difficulty that's now coming back to haunt them in this moment. And basically the way that we built it is you can roll on each of those columns and it'll give you a scene to then play out. And specifically the reason that we set it up this way is so that because you have the different tones and especially the related to, you can make it something that's going to evoke a feeling in the world that matters. Is this going to be, a brief, reprieve from the dangerous travel and the treacherous mission where the party finds a brief moment of beauty in a special quiet place? Or is it going to be a chaotic return of a rival who's found them on the road and tracked them here? It's all these different sort of tones and, connections can really bring about, a certain sense of like what you're trying to accomplish. And you don't have to, especially with the scenes, you don't have to roll on these if you just want to pick because you have something specifically in mind. It's like, oh, it'd be cool to have this sort of encounter. You can do that as well. And I'll put the chart up on the screen here as well of some examples, just as we did with the glances. But yeah, the scenes can basically give you a more zoomed in event, but it's designed to have it be very narrative, to get a very specific feeling, and to connect to the world in a way that makes it justify the time you're spending on it. Where the glances, you can just kind of run past. The scenes are a little bit meatier and ideally more connected in a way that's going to matter. So you can have it come back later or have it tie into things that have already happened and things like that in a way that can make it feel really alive.
Yeah, that's perfect. And so what I was going to do is talk about, basically I'm going to write a check, and then if we want to edit it out, we can edit it out. But because I have an idea, and then, so I'm going to say what my point was first, and then I'm going to say the idea. So the cool thing about the treacherous travel subsystem, the one that you create or the one in the book, is that you can prep this beforehand. So you can roll on whether it's your glance and you know that it's going to be inclement weather and you can tailor that to the exact region they're in. It's just like sort of like, I almost said purple rain, but I know that. So there's a Prince song playing. We just got DCMA'd. Sorry, guys. No, but essentially you can make it very specific to the region or the area. And then for the scenes, you can know that the party is just coming off of a session where something very dark and tragic happened. So maybe they need a hopeful moment. So you can choose hopeful from that list, and then they run into someone else, maybe, and so by rolling on these tables in your prep, travel will seem off the cuff and it will seem like it's random, but you have this waiting in your back pocket. Optionally, this is a middle ground for those who do like the random roll table effect, but don't want every single travel to just be, do we fight a bugbear or not? This is a way to still have that random feel where it's like, it can be anything, but your effects are, if they are mechanical, they're a little less than a full combat, a lot less than a full combat. And if they're narrative, you can get really creative with what that might be. So if you randomly rolled that it was going to be a volatile like tone, it was a mysterious occurrence as the event, and that it was a party member's past, that could be anything, any party member, and you can show that volatility in whatever way makes sense for the moment. So here's what we're going to do. In the description, you're going to find a Google Doc that has the first few entries of the glances and the scenes from A Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin. You can make a copy of this doc on your own drive and fill it out. And that way, you can have your own treacherous travel generator that works for your game, your table, your exact world. That would be, like I say, in the description, click it, make a copy of that doc, and then fill it out, and you'll be ready to go.
So, to some of you, it may feel like we just spent a long time, 2 videos, in fact, telling you that you shouldn't use random roll tables when you're traveling. And we did clarify that we meant specifically encounter roll tables. But I wanted to take a minute and compare what we're doing with the one way that we know that people do it, these random encounters, right? So between the scenes and the glances, we're doing what we set out to do. We want characters to know that they've traveled. It's kind of a funny way to put it, but really that's what we're going for. This is between telling them what happened, seeing the landscape, in our case, the inclement weather. So the players that are very narrative focused are going to remember that, and they're going to work in that their shoes are squishing all over the inn, floor when they walk in. but that your more mechanical players are going to realize that they got to use their Constitution saving throw because, otherwise they're going to take exhaustion. And if they did take exhaustion, their fun of the game of potentially being a little less narrative and more concerned about their character being the best, they're going to want to rest, and you're forcing the players to interact with the world, but not in the only way you've been taught, which is throw a monster at them. And again, somewhat of a bold claim, but the idea is we're doing the same thing. We're taxing the players, we're making the story go, but we're doing it in a way that is deliberate and that does what we want it to do. The moment we don't want to do this, we stop using the system and we come up with another one. And so I just want to throw out there that in every case when you're playing a role-playing game, remember that it's okay to ask why you're doing something and what your goal is. And I think in most cases, you're going to come up at the very least with a reason you don't like what exists, or come up with a way to do what you want to do better, and your players and you are going to have more fun.
So again, if you want these full fleshed out rules, they are available in A Dead Man's Guide to Dragon Grin, and it goes into much more detail and has the full roll tables. But if not, check out the doc in the description, and we'll also put some quick instructions on how to use this, specifically basically deciding how many of them and how long the travel is. There really aren't any rules for those. This is guidelines. So if you need to travel very far, it might be 2 or 3 glances or 2 scenes to evoke that it's longer travel. And we'll put a couple of little notes in there about how to use it. But overall, tell us how you handle travel. Is there a hex crawl system that you use? Like, what specific rule system have you found, if any, to handle travel? And is it mechanical? Is it narrative? What's your trick? What's your hack? So that is treacherous travel. Hopefully that helps. And, in the comments, if you have any ideas that you'd like to share for maybe a scene or a glance or an entry in one of those tables, that would be really fun. And then also, if you want to shoot us a message on Facebook, if you fill out one of those roll tables and want us to take a look at your work, that can always be inspirational. And so you can also do that as well. But we are Tabletop Terrors. Our whole deal is fun, creativity, tabletop games. If you love that stuff too, you should probably subscribe. We have a video that comes out every Sunday and Thursday. So if you want to be notified, also hit the notification bell. We always end things with a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
Slasha, kill them.
So Tim was subscribed to Dragon Magazine and Dungeon Magazine at some point. He's a little older than I am, so I was very young when these were around the house. But one of the best bits I ever read was there was a whole center portion of what must have been a Dragon Magazine about how to run your role-playing games like television shows. And it was the thrust of this whole issue. And I remember it opening my mind before I played role-playing games to the idea that if you make it more like shows, it will feel more like what you're used to. Because especially at that time, I imagine that a lot of people were trying to simulate, but also be their cool barbarian fantasy from Conan, and it just wasn't lining up. So I really appreciate the reading material that Tim gave me. Even, back a decade ago, must have been 15, almost 20 years ago now. Almost 25 years ago now. Guys, time is immutable and continues, whether you like it or not. That's the story of today's episode. But yeah, thanks, Tim. I don't know what to say.
You're welcome.